Alrighty, here are our notes on aquaculture. So, what is aquaculture? It's when you're cultivating organisms that live in the water, and you're growing them. It's kind of like agriculture, but in the water, hence the name. So you can raise species that live in any of the types of water that's freshwater, brackish water, or salt water. And this produces now around 50% of the seafood that we consume. So here you see a graph showing the increase in the amount of aquatic organisms that were growing by aquaculture. So aquatic plants would be things like seaweed. Seaweed can be used not only as a food source on its own, it's actually called nori in Japan, I believe. It's the covering that's used for sushi, and you can also buy seaweed snacks, which I actually buy, and they're tasty. We've been raising more fish in aquaculture. Here's mollusks. Crustaceans would include shrimp, crabs, lobster, etc. And other could include things like squid or octopus. Um, though I don't know how many of those we tend to raise because I don't think they're very well adapted in their lifestyle. So there are, of course, different types of aquaculture depending on where you're doing it. Onshore aquaculture is conducted basically in artificial facilities for the most part. You can do this in tanks inside. You can do this in ponds. You can have aquaponics, which is kind of like in tanks like hydroponics or raceways, which I'll show you an example of in a little bit. And this in these conditions, you have to control all the abiotic factors in the environment: temperature, nutrient levels, current, all of those things. If you want more natural conditions, you can have inshore, where you're doing this in shallow waters that are well sheltered, that you can kind of, not maybe not fence off, but you can kind of put like, a net in place to keep other organisms out and to keep the organisms you're farming in. Then there's offshore, which is where you have fenced or enclosed sections of water, or cages, racks, or bags. And these are organisms exposed to natural conditions. Unfortunately, you also don't control those conditions. And so in here we have a diagram that's just showing you various types of aquaculture. So you can have your water flow in a couple of ways. This, by the way, is a raceway. And it's called that because you're basically having water flowing through. So it almost looks like they're in lanes. And then you're going to have water outflow. The difference is you can have recirculating systems where you filter and then reuse the water. So you don't need a constant source of water coming in. If you have something that's flow through, then you're going to need a constant source of water coming in. And then also you're going to release something called effluent, which is the wastewater. And if you don't treat it properly to remove excess nutrients or antibiotics or pesticides or anything that's used, then that can become a major pollutant in the environment. So, freshwater aquaculture, a lot of the organisms that we produce by that are things like catfish or trout or tilapia. Here we have indoor, where you have like a tank or a pool where you're growing fish. And here we have like an outdoor pool where fish are being raised. So it's primarily ponds or tanks or other man-made systems. And you have to add the fish feed, you have to add whatever nutrients are needed, etc. And you have to unfortunately, when you're packing organisms in, they can produce a lot of waste. Everything those fish pee and poop um, ultimately is going to either stay in that pond or you're going to have to filter it and then put in new water. Mariculture is what we call marine aquaculture. It's in the ocean. So here you have these are, I think there are little lines hanging down with like clams and other mollusks. and I do not draw clams well, apparently. And so these people are in a raft and they're basically moving along, pulling up the racks and checking on oysters and clams, etc. One practice that's big in China, and this is a picture from Singapore, apparently. This is a sea cucumber. And it is an animal, but you can grow it to eat. And then you can either farm shellfish by like putting small, uh, tiny shellfish on the seafloor, so that way you can come back and harvest in that area, or you can grow them directly there or in floating cages, or I've seen some systems where they just have a rope hanging and they have, you know, like here we're gonna draw oysters because they are easier than clams, and have those shellfish just kind of hanging off of it. So, what are the benefits of aquaculture? Well, the biggest benefit is that it reduces the pressure on wild fish stocks. You're not out there hunting them, you're not out there catching them, and so it allows them to recover while also feeding our growing need for uh, animal protein from seafood. It can be highly efficient because the fish are more efficient at turning the food they're fed into body protein that we can then eat than are a lot of the land animals. Doesn't require as much water, although the disadvantage of that is that you then have these dense populations of fish. You don't have to have as much fuel because you don't have to, like, take your boat out to where the fish are. You can use things like biological control methods to manage parasites. Like you've probably heard of cleaner fish. Actually, we talked about them when we talked about symbioses. And so these can remove parasites and stuff without you having to use any sort of pesticide. And then some species can actually help the water quality of ecosystems that have already been damaged and provide habitats. So if you're farming seaweed, seaweed removes nutrients from the water because seaweed is related to plants. It's not exactly a plant, but that nutrient removed from the water can decrease the consequences of eutrophication. It also takes out CO2 because it performs photosynthesis, which reduces ocean acidification in the area, which, as we talk about climate change, we'll talk about how that's a big concern for the ocean. And then shellfish are water filters. They filter feed, so they suck in water, they feed out any little bits and particles, and then they release clean water. So they can clean up the water and improve water quality. So if you've got an area with like a lot of not dirt, but a lot of stuff floating in the water, you plant some shellfish there, and they could help improve the water quality. I'm not guaranteeing it because I don't want you to start a shellfish farm and come back and sue me. So here we have some ways in which we can have benefits. So shellfish and seaweed can mitigate pollution, so decrease pollution. That's what we see here. You can also plant them in coastal waters and estuaries where they can pick up some of the extra nutrients that get put into the water by runoff from farms and the fertilizer. Um, there are a lot of native oyster populations that have been lost and seaweed communities that have been declined. So it can help provide some of the benefits to the local ecosystems. Like I said, it can provide habitats for species that used to live in naturally occurring oyster populations or seaweed communities if they're not extinct yet. Um, and then the gear that you use, what you use, like these hanging racks that you see here, or some cages, can provide habitats for other fish, crustaceans, and invertebrates that will live in there. And then they can take out carbon dioxide and add oxygen to the water. And for example, if you increase water clarity because you've got some shellfish filtering, then you can have some producers move back in, which can then, help the local ecosystem recover because they're the base of the food chain, because now the water is clear enough for photosynthesis. As with anything, there are drawbacks to aquaculture. So, depending on where you put your aquaculture establishment, if you're using up native habitats or destroying ecosystems, then that can destroy fish habitats. For example, shrimp farming, tropical shrimp farming especially, has led to the destruction of about 20% of the mangrove forests. And mangrove forests are very important ecosystems. They, if you remember, exist in coastal areas, in brackish water. They provide habitats for a lot of fish, and they're large trees, so they take up a lot of carbon. And so when you destroy those, you're having impacts on a global scale. And then a lot of these shrimp farms, they grow fish in a very dense population, and then toxins and other things build up. The nutrients in the area may be lost, and then you end up having to go and clear more mangrove forest to grow new shrimp. This is kind of very similar to what's done in the Amazon rainforest, where you clear some land, you use it for a few years, use it up, and then have to move on and destroy more habitat. You have to be very careful that your fish don't escape, especially if you have genetically modified fish, which are found in aquaculture. For example, there's like a breed of salmon that's got a gene from another species that lets it grow bigger, so that way we can get bigger fish. But if that got out into wild fish, one, those escaped fish, if enough of them escape, they can become invasive, or they can outcompete the native species, or they can interbreed with wild fish and get some of these transgenic genes out into other fish populations, and we don't know what the impacts of that would be. As always, when you pack a lot of creatures in a small space, that increases the transmission of disease as well as parasites. And so that's a big problem. And then if you have any wild fish that are closely related in the area or of the same species, then those diseases can be transmitted to them. And then we tend to have, as in most of our food production, something more like a monoculture, very genetically similar fish, because we want them to all have this group of traits: grow fast on minimal feed, and then they are all genetically similar, and that can increase susceptibility of the population, or how vulnerable it is to disease. Then we talked about effluent, but that is the wastewater that comes out of these places. We'll mention effluent again when we talk about, for example, sewage treatment plants. It's basically the water you're releasing from something, and this can be a major contaminant. So if it's not treated, or even depending on how it's treated, it can contain antibiotics and pesticides. Antibiotics can contribute to antibiotic resistance development in bacteria, and pesticides can kill non-target species. Or there's also bioaccumulation, and it can even get into humans. Fish waste contains nitrogen and phosphorus, which promotes algal growth, which can cause algal blooms, which are toxic to fish. So those are some of the negative consequences if you don't plan your effluent treatment correctly. And then there's a problem with farming carnivorous fish. So let's say you wanted to start growing some bluefin tuna. So that's a good money grower. The thing is they are um quaternary consumers. No, they're tertiary consumers, my bad. Here are your producers, and they are tertiary consumers, which means that one, it's not as efficient to eat there on the food chain, but another thing, they eat other fish. So in the past, to farm salmon, what we've done is we've caught wild fish, ground them up, turned them into fish feed, and fished them and fed them to our salmon. But that doesn't stop the problem of overfishing. And then, so that also will affect how wild predators that feed on those feed fish will survive as well. Another thing, we also farm fish because you may have heard of omega-3 fatty acids. Fish are supposed to be a very good source of that, but they take this in from algae they eat. So they don't produce it themselves. Instead, you have these omega-3 fatty acids that the algae produce that can get eaten by a primary consumer, which gets eaten by a secondary consumer, which then gets eaten by your tertiary consumer. And so if you have fish that you're just feeding like plants like from land, then they're not going to get those fatty acids, which will reduce the value of your fish. Because part of the reason why people may switch to a more fish diet is they're trying to get those omega-3 fatty acids, which are supposed to be better for brain health. Here's just another diagram that's showing like some of the negative impacts of aquaculture. So here we have a bloom of algae. Then here we have, like, for example, a pond, and we have our fish kind of penned off, and we have some wild fish populations. But the fish parasites and pathogens can also spread. They can be increasing the amount of carbon dioxide, reducing the amount of oxygen, and so that all that negatively impacts fish species. It can also cause invasive species. You may clear out some of your vegetation in the area to construct the fish pond, which in turn affects biodiversity, the productivity, and disrupting ecosystem processes. Then any fish feed, you tend to overfeed organisms sometimes, especially fish. I don't know if you've had fish. I would accidentally overfeed mine. And so you put fish feed down, and whatever they don't catch ends up settling on the bottom, and as well as the waste. And so all of that, the nutrients that you put there are going to cause eutrophication. Eutrophication can lead to algal blooms, which causes anoxia, which are conditions where you don't have enough oxygen. Then there are some species of algae that can produce toxins, and if you give them a lot of nitrate, they'll grow out of control. So there are a lot of negative impacts that can happen when you don't plan your aquaculture right. So how to how to improve sustainability of aquaculture? Well, plan better. Make sure that your effluent is getting treated before it's leaving your aquaculture area. Make sure that you're siting these in areas where it won't disrupt endangered or protected ecosystems. Trying to get carnivorous species to eat plant-based feed can reduce the need to go and feed fish for wild fish feed. And then there's something else called multitrophic aquaculture, which reduces nutrient waste and improves efficiency. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. So here's an example of this is from the Nature Conservancy, and this is kind of their recommendations for where to perform aquaculture. So areas that are need to be protected, like mangrove areas or a seagrass meadow, you don't do aquaculture there. Then, you may have a village or something, but you could farm seaweed in areas near the coast where you have like a river coming in, because that allows you to have excess nutrients taken from the water so that when it empties into the ocean, it's not nutrient rich and causing decreases in water quality. Then you don't want to use shallow waters to do your aquaculture, because this is where you'll have coral reefs. This is where you might have native producers, and so you don't want to disturb that. And so out here, you could have like net pen farming where you have your fish in a net. This is a major commercial fishing area, so you don't want to compete with the native fisheries. Out here, here's where there's a coral reef, so you don't want to fish there. And then, if you're too far from a port city or too far from wherever there's land, then that can pose a problem as well, because that it takes too much fuel to get that back to the area where you're harvesting. So, you're not going to have aquaculture areas out in the deep ocean. It's not cost effective because you have to get a boat out there. And as I've said in class, I don't think we have electric boats yet. So this is what I was talking about, integrated multitrophic aquaculture. So what you do is, instead of growing one species en masse, you grow multiple species. So it kind of lets you harvest more than one thing. So you plant or grow things that will complement each other. This mimics the diversity of a natural ecosystem a little more. So for example, you have your fish cages. You might raise some shellfish in the area, and they will filter the water. Then you might have some algae or seaweed that you grow there. You don't even have to necessarily harvest them, because they can serve as a food source for fish. But the big thing is they absorb nutrients. And so they take in nutrients so you're not polluting the surrounding area. Same thing, you can have some shellfish or organisms that feed on their bottom dwellers and they feed on whatever falls on the bottom. So, here, for example, would be sea cucumbers, as an example. They'll take in some of that waste, and so you won't have a buildup of waste. And so, that is a little more complicated, and you have to plan it, make sure you have an effective area, and it may reduce the efficiency of harvesting just because you have multiple things in an area, but it's a lot healthier. So that is aquaculture. Next topic, there will be some agriculture notes put in because I know those are missing, and then we'll have mining notes up soon.